Sometimes the darkest truths come from the people we trust the most. Are you ready for these disturbing revelations? Story 1. The Stranger on the Webcam. My Aunt Claire had spent most of her adult life in a comfortable, long-term relationship. After more than 10 years together, the engagement fell apart, and for the first time she found herself navigating the murky waters of online dating. Lonely and eager for connection, she met someone who seemed too good to be true, a mysterious man named Daniel. Daniel didn't own a webcam but always wanted to watch Claire as they chatted. He convinced her to keep her webcam on while they talked late into the night. Sometimes he even asked her to leave the webcam running as she fell asleep. Though it felt strange, Claire brushed it off, chalking it up to her longing for companionship. For months, their relationship stayed virtual. He typed while she talked, growing closer to someone she had never actually seen or heard. But things took a bizarre turn when Claire finally insisted on a phone call. The voice on the other end wasn't Daniel. It wasn't even a man. It was a woman. Startled, Claire demanded an explanation. That's when the woman revealed something chilling. My brother's soul lives inside me. That's the man you've been talking to. Most people would have run far away. But Claire didn't. She felt a strange pull, a need to believe the unbelievable. So, she did the unthinkable. She drove all the way from Vermont to Arizona to meet this woman, bringing her back home to live with her and her 3 young children. At first, things were just strange. The woman, named Lena, performed odd rituals around the house, leaving bundles of sage outside her children's doors, claiming to sense evil spirits. She convinced Claire to sell most of her belongings, saying they attracted bad energy. Once, she fell down the stairs, breaking her arm, and claimed it was the spirits pushing her. Then, inexplicably, Claire and Lena entered into a civil union. That's when the situation spiraled into horror. One night, Claire's youngest son went missing. She found Lena trying to bundle him into a car, claiming she was saving him from the evil spirits and taking him to a safe place in Arizona. Luckily, Claire stopped her before she could disappear. But it didn't end there. Lena had drained both Claire's and her parents' bank accounts, leaving them in financial ruin. The union was annulled. Lena vanished as mysteriously as she had appeared. To this day, my aunt doesn't know where she went. If someone revealed a dark, otherworldly secret to you, would you believe them? Or would you walk away? Let me know what you'd do. Story 2. The Funeral Home's Dark Secret. The small, unassuming funeral home had been in Mr. and Mrs. Whitlock's family for generations. Their 2 sons, David and Noah, grew up surrounded by the scent of lilies and the solemn hush of grieving families. But beneath the respectful facade of the family business lay a secret that would burn its way to the surface in a way no one could have anticipated. What the town didn't know, and what even David didn't know, was that Noah wasn't his full brother. Noah was the result of an affair Mrs. Whitlock had with an employee who worked at the funeral home years before. Only Mr. and Mrs. Whitlock, along with the employee, knew the truth. To everyone else, the boys were simply brothers. But there was always something different about David. David was a quiet child, but not in the shy, introspective way most children might be. His silence carried an unsettling weight. His eyes, though young, seemed to have a cold detachment, and his strange fascination with death went beyond what might be expected from growing up in a funeral home. When he was just 8 years old, David began catching small animals in the woods behind the funeral home, performing what he called funeral experiments. Mrs. Whitlock brushed it off as a phase. Mr. Whitlock, however, grew increasingly uneasy. The tension in the household grew unbearable as David's behavior became more erratic. He began lashing out, stealing things, and even locking his younger brother Noah in closets, claiming it was training for the afterlife. Still, no one could have predicted the horror to come. One humid summer evening when David was 12, the unthinkable happened. The Whitlocks were awoken by the acrid smell of smoke. Flames licked the walls of the funeral home, engulfing the building with terrifying speed. Mr. and Mrs. Whitlock rushed to save their sons, but the fire spread too quickly. Trapped inside, they perished in the blaze. When the fire was finally extinguished, only David emerged, coughing and covered in soot. He claimed Noah had been lost in the fire along with their parents. The town mourned the tragic loss, and David, the sole survivor, was sent to live with a relative. But some of the townspeople whispered that the fire hadn't been an accident. What no one realized was that Noah wasn't dead. As the fire raged, the funeral home employee, his biological father, had pulled Noah from the flames. The boy was alive but horribly scarred, and his burns left him unrecognizable. Unable to reveal the truth for fear of exposing his affair, the employee hid Noah away in a mental institution, claiming it was for his recovery. For years, Noah grew up believing he had been abandoned by his family. Meanwhile, David grew into adulthood and returned to the family business. He reopened the funeral home, building it from the ashes and continuing its legacy. To the townspeople, he was a testament to resilience. But behind the scenes, David had changed. The fire had done more than take his family, it had awakened something darker in him. He became obsessed with power, control, and legacy, believing he was destined to restore the funeral home to greatness. The employee who had saved Noah remained in David's life, working quietly as an undertaker and keeping his secret. But he couldn't stay silent forever. 20 years after the fire, David's carefully constructed world came crashing down. While watching a news segment on an art therapy program for burn victims, he saw a face he hadn't seen in decades, a face he believed had perished in the fire. It was Noah. He was alive, his face obscured by a mask to hide his scars, but there was no mistaking him. David felt a cold dread settle over him. The revelation unraveled everything. Noah, now a grown man, returned to the small town to reclaim what he believed was his birthright. The funeral home wasn't just a business to him, it was a legacy stolen from him by the brother who had tried to kill him. The two brothers, one twisted by years of guilt and secrecy and the other hardened by betrayal and suffering, became locked in a bitter feud. The funeral home turned into a battleground, with David refusing to give up what he saw as his rightful inheritance and Noah determined to expose the truth about the fire. To this day, the town whispers about the feud between the brothers, one who built his life on ashes and lies, and the other who emerged from the flames with vengeance in his heart. If you discovered a family member had tried to erase you from existence, would you seek revenge or forgiveness? What would you do in Noah's place? Story 3: The Kennedy Family's Sinister Silence. Every family has its secrets, but for the Kennedy family, their dark secret was locked away in the walls of their grand estate, out of sight, out of mind. From the outside, they were the picture-perfect family, elegant parties, polished smiles, and a legacy of wealth and power. But beneath the glimmering surface lay a story so disturbing it would send shivers down anyone's spine. It began in the late 1950s when Rose Kennedy gave birth to her third child, a baby girl named Lila. The labor was difficult, but not for medical reasons. The doctor, who was running late, insisted that no one else deliver the baby, as he wanted to receive the hefty delivery fee. Following orders, the attending nurse was forced to hold Lila's head inside the birth canal for hours while Rose endured excruciating pain, begging them to let her push. When the doctor finally arrived, it was too late. Lila had suffered catastrophic oxygen deprivation. Though she survived, the lack of oxygen had irreparably damaged her brain. The Kennedy family's picture-perfect image now had a perceived blemish, and Joseph Kennedy, the family patriarch, was determined to keep it hidden. For the first few years of her life, Lila was kept within the family's sprawling estate, away from public view. Rose tried to bond with her daughter, but Joseph's shame about her condition created a wedge. He began to refer to Lila as the family's shadow and insisted she not appear at family functions or be mentioned to outsiders. As Lila grew, her cognitive impairments became more evident. She would laugh loudly at inappropriate times, blurt out unfiltered thoughts, and struggle to control her emotions. But more than anything, Joseph feared one thing above all else. What if she grew older, fell in love, and got pregnant? To him, the thought of a grandchild with disabilities tarnishing the Kennedy legacy was unthinkable. That's when he devised a chilling solution. Without Rose's knowledge or consent, Joseph began consulting with doctors on experimental procedures. The solution came in the form of a lobotomy, a new and controversial surgical operation meant to calm patients with mental illnesses or developmental disorders. Joseph convinced himself that this was for Lila's own good, that it would make her normal, or at the very least manageable. When Lila was just 11 years old, Joseph had her sedated and taken to a private hospital. There, surgeons performed the procedure, making a series of cuts into her brain. The operation didn't go as planned. Lila emerged from the surgery a shadow of her former self, unable to speak, unable to function independently, and completely unresponsive. Her lively personality, her unfiltered laughter, and her emotional outbursts were gone. She was now eerily silent, staring blankly into space. Rose was devastated when she learned what had been done to her daughter. She begged Joseph to let Lila come home, but he refused. Lila was sent to a private institution, far away from prying eyes, and her existence was erased from the family narrative. Whenever the Kennedy children asked about their sister, they were told that she had moved to a remote town to teach and didn't want to be disturbed. For years, Lila lived alone in the institution, visited occasionally by a caretaker who brought her gifts from her mother. Joseph, however, never visited her once. To him, the operation had been a success. The blemish on the family's reputation was gone. Decades passed and the truth about Lila remained hidden, until Joseph's death. While sorting through his personal papers, one of his grandsons uncovered Lila's medical records and pieced together the horrific truth. Enraged, he confronted his mother, who broke down and admitted everything. Lila's story began to spread among the family, and guilt consumed them. But by then it was too late to make amends. Lila passed away in the institution at the age of 47, having spent her entire life locked away because her father cared more about appearances than his own daughter's happiness. To this day, the Kennedy family refuses to speak publicly about Lila. Her name is a whispered secret, her story buried under layers of shame. But some family members still visit her grave, leaving small tokens of love and regret, trying in some small way to make up for the years stolen from her. If you were part of this family, would you fight to expose the truth about Lila, or keep the secret to preserve your family's reputation? Story 4. The terrifying legacy of my uncle's first marriage. Every family has a member whose past seems like a locked box, sealed away with whispered warnings never to pry. For me, that person is my uncle. On the surface, he seems like any other family man, successful, charming, and devoted to his third wife and their young son. But when I started digging into his past, I found a horrifying story of manipulation, violence, and secrets that still haunt our family. My uncle, let's call him Daniel, has been married 3 times. His first marriage was to a quiet woman named Ling, and they had one daughter, Sarah, who's now in her 30s. I never met Sarah, and no one ever talked about Ling. It was as if they didn't exist. All I knew was that Daniel had remarried, had 2 more daughters with his second wife, and eventually left her too. His third and current marriage produced a son, my younger cousin, who grew up with me. I never thought much about why his first 2 families were so disconnected, until 2 years ago when I found out the horrifying truth. Ling wasn't just a woman Daniel had a failed marriage with. She was his victim. In his early 20s, Daniel was a deeply troubled man with a history of violence. He attacked and raped Ling while they were dating, leaving her pregnant. Ling's family, facing the crushing societal shame of an unmarried pregnancy in 1970s China, forced Daniel to marry her. For years she endured his emotional abuse while raising their daughter, Sarah. He resented her, blamed her for trapping him, and treated her like a burden. Eventually, Daniel fell in love with another woman, someone younger, more outgoing, and completely opposite to Ling. This woman was his second wife, the one he abandoned Ling for after years of cheating. To make the break clean, Daniel cut all ties with Ling and Sarah. He moved to a new city, started a new life, and pretended his first family didn't exist. Years later, his second marriage ended in chaos too. His new wife found out about his violent past through whispers from distant relatives. Terrified of what he might do, she took their daughters and disappeared, leaving Daniel alone once again. By the time Daniel married his third wife, he had perfected the art of reinvention. To her, he was a loving, attentive partner who had been unlucky in love. He built a life with her, carefully hiding the skeletons in his closet. My younger cousin, their son, grew up thinking his dad was a hard-working, family-oriented man. He has no idea about the 2 families his father abandoned, or the crimes he committed in his youth. But here's where the story takes an even darker turn. A few months ago, Sarah, Daniel's daughter from his first marriage, contacted me on social media. She had been searching for her father for years, trying to understand why he left. When I told her he had a whole new family, she broke down. She told me about the abuse her mother suffered, how she grew up believing it was somehow her fault that Daniel left, and how Ling had never recovered emotionally. I asked Sarah if she wanted to confront him, but she said no. She just wanted closure, for herself, for her mother, and for her half-siblings who didn't even know she existed. Now I'm left with a choice. Do I tell my younger cousin the truth about his father's past? Do I risk shattering the image of the man he idolizes? Or do I keep this secret, allowing Daniel's lies to fester in the dark corners of our family history? If you discovered a horrifying secret about a close family member, would you confront them or protect their carefully constructed facade? What would you do? Story 5. The Medium's Web of Lies. In every family, there's always one relative who seems to operate in their own little world, scheming, lying, and manipulating their way through life. In my husband's family, that person was his Uncle Greg, a man whose greed knew no bounds and whose actions left scars that may never heal. This is the story of how he scammed his own mother, destroyed relationships, and left our entire family in ruins. It all began when my husband's grandmother, Eleanor, began showing signs of aging. She was slowing down physically, a little more forgetful, and clearly in need of some support. Eleanor had lived in the same house for decades, a charming, slightly run-down home that held years of memories. But to Greg, her house wasn't a family treasure, it was a payday. Greg concocted a plan so diabolical, it could have been straight out of a movie. He hired a local medium, a woman named Anita, known for her uncanny ability to connect with the spirits, to convince Eleanor that her deceased husband, Harold, was trying to communicate from beyond the grave. Greg fed Anita intimate details about Eleanor's life and her greatest fears, arming her with the ammunition she needed to manipulate his own mother. During their first session, Anita told Eleanor that Harold was unhappy on the other side. He was restless, pacing, waiting for Eleanor to make things right. "What was wrong?" Eleanor asked, horrified. Anita looked her straight in the eyes and said, "He's ashamed of the family." Eleanor was devastated. Harold had been her everything, her rock, the love of her life. She couldn't bear the thought of disappointing him even in death. Anita said Harold's shame was tied to their daughter, my husband's mother, Linda. She claimed that Linda had recently had an abortion, and that Harold was now in the afterlife, holding the soul of the unborn baby, crying. The lies cut deeper than anyone could have imagined. Eleanor had always been devoutly religious, and the thought of her daughter committing what she saw as a mortal sin shattered her. Anita urged Eleanor to restore the family's honor by selling her house, giving the money to Greg, and moving into assisted living. According to Anita, Harold's spirit insisted this was the only way to lift the shame from their family's name. Eleanor believed every word. She sold the house she had lived in for over 40 years. She gave Greg every penny of the proceeds. Then she cut Linda out of her life entirely, calling her a disgrace, a sinner, and an embarrassment to the family. Linda, heartbroken and confused, tried to reconcile, but Eleanor refused. The pain drove a wedge so deep into the family that it felt like it would never heal. Years later, the truth finally came out, but only because Greg got drunk at a local pub and started bragging about how he had scammed his own mother. He laughed about how easy it was to manipulate Eleanor, mocking her for believing in spirits and mediums. When word of his confession got back to the family, the fallout was catastrophic. Eleanor, now frail and deeply confused, couldn't fully grasp what had happened. Linda, who had carried the weight of fabricated shame for years, was furious but also broken. And Greg? He disappeared, taking the money and leaving the rest of us to pick up the pieces. To this day, my husband's family is still reeling from the betrayal. Eleanor passed away a few years ago, and Linda still struggles to forgive herself for the shame she never should have felt. As for Greg, no one knows where he is, or if he even feels a shred of remorse for what he did. If someone you trusted manipulated a loved one into turning against you, how far would you go to uncover the truth and set things right? Would you seek revenge, or let it go? Story 6. The mysterious death of the wealthy scientist. Every family has skeletons in the closet, but my mother's side of the family might be hiding something far darker, a secret that has haunted us for decades. It revolves around my grandfather's sudden, unexplained death when he was just 35 years old. A man who was not only healthy but also brilliant and deeply accomplished. My grandfather, Dr. Edward Clark, was a scientist who worked for NASA, taught at MIT and held several patents. He was a rising star in his field, the kind of man who was respected and envied. My grandmother, Lillian, was beautiful, charming, and, as I would later come to suspect, manipulative. Together they had 3 children, and by all appearances they were the perfect family. But beneath the surface, there were cracks that no one could see. One night everything changed. My grandmother took her children, my mother and her siblings, to the movies. They had a lovely evening, popcorn in hand, laughing at the screen. But when they returned home, my grandmother insisted that the children stay in the car while she went into the house alone. A few minutes later, an ambulance arrived. My grandfather was carried out on a stretcher, lifeless. My grandmother told the children he had suffered a massive heart attack. The death certificate listed the cause of death as cardiac arrest. My grandmother refused to allow an autopsy, saying it was too painful and unnecessary. Everyone accepted her explanation. Why wouldn't they? She was a grieving widow, left to raise 3 children on her own. But as the years went by, whispers began to circulate. For starters, my grandfather had been in perfect health. He was an athlete, a non-smoker, and had no history of heart problems. Then there was the fact that my grandmother had been having an affair with a man named Richard, someone she had met through a charity event. Richard was a successful businessman, charming and persuasive. He and my grandmother had been seeing each other for over a year, but no one in the family knew at the time. The most damning clue came after my grandfather's death. Almost immediately, my grandmother inherited a significant amount of money from his patents, his teaching work, and his NASA projects. She wasted no time in investing that money, not in the family but in Richard's business ventures. But here's the twist: Richard's business didn't exist. He took every penny of my grandmother's money and disappeared without a trace. My mother and her siblings began piecing things together as they grew older. The timeline didn't add up. Why had my grandmother insisted on going into the house alone that night? Why had she refused an autopsy? And why had she so blindly handed over everything to Richard? My mother believes that Richard may have convinced my grandmother to get rid of my grandfather. Perhaps it was poison staged to look like a heart attack. Perhaps my grandmother, blinded by her infatuation, believed Richard would take care of her and the children if Edward was out of the picture. But when Richard disappeared, she was left with nothing but regret and 3 children who would grow up to resent her. To this day, my mother is the only one of her siblings who still speaks to my grandmother. The others cut ties long ago, unable to forgive her for what they believe she did. My grandmother has never admitted to anything, but there's a shadow in her eyes whenever my grandfather's name is mentioned. At this point, she's old and frail, and my mother feels that it's too late to demand the truth. But for the rest of us, the question remains: did Lillian Clark, the grieving widow, kill her husband? Or was it all just a tragic coincidence? What would you do if you suspected someone in your family of committing the ultimate betrayal? Would you confront them even if it meant shattering the family forever? Or would you let the secret die with them? Story 7. The Sinister Spiral of Guilt. Growing up, my family always had its quirks, but nothing prepared me for the dark truth I uncovered about my brother's life. A truth that has haunted me and my sister to this day. The story begins long before any of us were born, with a choice my mother made out of despair. Years ago, before my brother was conceived, my mother was battling severe depression. One night, in the throes of hopelessness, she tried to take her own life by drinking bleach. She survived, but the physical and emotional scars lingered. Shortly after this incident, she discovered she was pregnant with my brother. At the time, she didn't think the failed suicide attempt had any lasting consequences. She believed she could move forward, start anew, and be a good mother. But when my brother was born, it became clear that something wasn't right. As a child, my brother was different. While the rest of us thrived academically and socially, he struggled. He exhibited odd behaviors, clapping randomly, whispering to himself, and isolating himself from the family. He would talk to himself in strange voices, creating imaginary conversations that no one else could understand. My parents dismissed it as a phase, but deep down, my mom knew something was wrong. She just couldn't bring herself to face it. As he grew older, the signs became harder to ignore. He struggled in school, falling behind in every subject. Teachers suggested evaluations, but my father refused. He was a proud man, stubborn and unwilling to admit that his son might need help. My brother was pushed harder, disciplined more strictly, and berated for not meeting expectations he couldn't possibly achieve. Meanwhile, my mother swung in the opposite direction. She coddled him, spoiled him, and made excuses for his behavior. It was as if her guilt over what she had done years earlier consumed her. My sister and I were caught in the middle. We didn't understand why our brother got special treatment while we were held to such high standards. But as we got older, pieces of the puzzle started to fall into place. One night, during a rare moment of vulnerability, my mother confessed everything to me. She told me about the bleach, about her guilt, and about the possibility that her actions might have caused my brother's condition. I was stunned. It was like a dark cloud settled over everything I thought I knew about my family. Suddenly, my mother's overprotectiveness and my father's harshness made sense. They were two sides of the same coin, guilt and denial. My mother couldn't forgive herself, and my father couldn't admit that something was wrong. My brother, oblivious to the weight of these secrets, grew into adulthood. But the challenges he faced never went away. He became reclusive, withdrawn, and started drinking heavily. The drinking made him unpredictable. Sometimes he was quiet and harmless, other times he scared us with his erratic behavior. There were nights when I would hear him pacing the house, talking to himself in those strange voices, and I would lie awake, wondering if he was okay, or if we were safe. Despite everything, I couldn't blame him. He didn't ask for this life. He didn't choose to be born into a family that was so broken by guilt and denial. And yet, the weight of his existence fell on all of us. Today, my sister and I try to be kind to him. We include him in family gatherings, check in on him when we can, and do our best to make him feel loved. But the truth is, we're afraid. Not of him, but of what might happen if he continues down this path. Will the drinking get worse? Will he hurt himself? Or will he simply fade away, Another casualty of my parents' inability to face the truth? If you discovered a family secret that explained years of pain and dysfunction, would you confront it or keep it buried to protect those involved? How much of the past would you be willing to dig up if it meant finding peace? Story 8. Shadows in the Business World. There's a secret I've carried for years, a secret about my father's death. Officially, he died of a heart attack while on a business trip, but what I saw and uncovered tells a much darker story. To this day, no one else in my family knows the truth. They live with the version I brought home, but I live with the lies I was forced to swallow. My father was a successful businessman, always juggling big deals and partnerships. A few weeks before he passed, he confided in me that he was on the brink of closing a life-changing deal. He said we'd soon be living in luxury, free from financial worry. It wasn't like him to talk about his work in detail, so I knew it was important. Then just like that, he was gone. It was my responsibility to fly to the small, remote town where he died, handle the paperwork, and bring his body home. When I arrived, everything seemed off. The local police handed me a death certificate with cardiac arrest scrawled across it, but their explanations were vague and evasive. I asked questions, but they quickly shut me down, brushing me off like a pesky tourist. It didn't sit right with me. When I saw my father's body at the local morgue, I froze. There were bruises on his arms, faint marks on his neck, and scratches on his hands, signs of a struggle. This wasn't the peaceful passing of a man whose heart had simply given out. Something violent had happened. I demanded answers, but the coroner refused to look me in the eye. It was clear someone had already pressured them to stay quiet. My father had been working with a group of powerful men, wealthy, influential figures who were well connected in both legal and illegal circles. They were the kind of people you didn't question, let alone accuse. These men were supposedly his business partners, but I'd always found them intimidating, even sinister. After his death, they disappeared from our lives entirely. No condolences, no explanations, just silence. I started piecing things together. My father had mentioned he was about to finalize the deal of a lifetime. He never told me the details, but I suspected it involved these men. Did he back out at the last minute? Did they feel betrayed? Or was it simply greed that drove them to take his life and steal what should have been ours? I wanted to fight for justice, to demand an investigation, but I quickly realized I was out of my depth. These men had money, power, and connections that reached far beyond anything I could imagine. The local authorities were clearly under their thumb, and pushing for answers would only put me and my family in danger. So, I did the unthinkable. I agreed to the official story. I signed the papers that listed his death as a heart attack, had his body cremated, and brought his ashes home. I told my mother and brother that it had been quick and painless, sparing them the horrific details of what I suspected really happened. The money my father had spoken of, the fortune he was so excited about, was gone. I never saw a single penny of it. His business partners had made sure of that. Years have passed and the truth still eats away at me. My mother and brother believe my father died a natural death. They've moved on, finding comfort in the lie I gave them. But I can't move on. I can't forget the bruises, the silence of the authorities, or the smug faces of the men who likely had blood on their hands. Sometimes I wonder if I should have fought harder, risked everything to expose what really happened. But then I think about my family. Would they have been able to handle the truth? Or would it have destroyed them? If you were faced with undeniable evidence that a loved one's death wasn't natural, would you fight for justice no matter the cost? Or would you bury the truth to protect your family from the pain? Story 9. The Legacy of Shadows. When I turned 16, I thought I was about to have a typical father-son moment, some kind of bonding story. But instead, my father sat me down and said, "You're old enough now to hear the family secret." I laughed, thinking it was going to be something harmless, maybe an embarrassing story or a quirky family tradition. But as he started talking, my world turned upside down. "You've barely seen your grandfather," he began, "and there's a reason for that. My grandfather, my dad's father, wasn't just some distant old man from Russia. He was part of an organization, the Russian mob." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. My dad told me that despite my grandfather's criminal ties, he was still a good man. He assured me we were safe, but his words didn't bring any comfort. Then he pulled out a photo. In it, my grandfather sat at a table with several dangerous-looking men. There were bottles of vodka, cigarettes, and stern expressions. It was like a scene from a mob movie, but this was my family. I stared at the picture, trying to reconcile the loving but distant figure I barely knew with this image of a criminal. But that wasn't even the biggest bombshell. What came next changed how I saw not just my father's side of the family, but also my mother's. My dad leaned forward and said, "Your mother's family has its own history too." My maternal grandmother, who I'd always known as a kind, quiet woman from Shanghai, had a dark past. Before she met my maternal grandfather, the Englishman, she had been married to another man. That man, as it turned out, wasn't just anyone. He was part of a powerful criminal organization in Shanghai. Their marriage had been a tumultuous one, but she hadn't left him, until she met my maternal grandfather. They had an affair, and when my grandmother got pregnant with my mom, she stayed with her husband. They raised my mom as if she were their own child. But as my mom grew older, tensions rose. My grandmother's husband became paranoid, believing that my mom wasn't really his daughter. When my grandmother finally confessed the truth, chaos erupted. She fled with my mom and my grandfather, the English one, and they started a new life. My mom never knew the full extent of the danger they escaped. Hearing this, I felt like my entire family history was a web of crime, betrayal, and secrets. But my father wasn't done. He told me there was something else I needed to know. Years later, my paternal grandfather met my maternal grandfather. It wasn't a friendly encounter. These two men from two different criminal worlds had crossed paths before. Back in the 1920s, their organizations had clashed over arms trading. Their meeting reignited old tensions, and the result was deadly. My paternal grandfather ordered a hit on my maternal grandfather. My mom was already engaged to my dad at this point, and when she learned what had happened, she was devastated. She broke off the engagement and disappeared. My dad didn't see her again for years. When they finally reconnected, she was pregnant. With me. My dad took full custody of me when I was born, but my mom didn't stay in our lives. She moved around the world, trying to escape the shadow of her past. She died young at 40 in a freak accident, a shark attack while she was on a trip to the Caribbean. To this day, I wonder if it really was an accident or if the ghosts of her past had caught up with her. As if that wasn't enough, my dad dropped one final bombshell. The woman I had called Mom my entire life wasn't my biological mother. She was his second wife, a kind-hearted woman from Holland who had raised me as her own. My real mom, the one with the criminal bloodlines, was long gone by the time I was old enough to remember her. At this point, I was in shock. My entire family history was a maze of lies, crime, and secrets. I didn't know who I could trust or what to believe. Even now, years later, I still struggle to piece it all together. Story 10. The Haunting of Room 420. It was the summer before my senior year of college when I landed a job at a quaint but slightly run-down hotel on the outskirts of town. It wasn't glamorous, but the pay was decent and the work seemed easy enough, checking guests in, answering the phone, and occasionally helping with room service. But there was one peculiar rule that stood out during my orientation. Under no circumstances, the manager, Mr. Grayson, said sternly, "Are you to enter room 427? If a guest complains about noise from that room, apologize and move them to another room. If the room phone rings, you don't answer it. And if you see the door open, no matter what, you don't go inside." I laughed nervously, thinking it was some sort of joke. "What? Is it haunted or something?" Mr. Grayson didn't laugh. "Just don't go in there. Ever." I chalked it up to hotel lore meant to scare the newbies, but as the weeks went on, the strange rule started to bother me. Guests would occasionally ask about noises coming from room 427. Footsteps, muffled conversations, even sobbing late at night. One time, an older couple demanded to be moved because they heard someone laughing hysterically in the middle of the night, even though the room was supposedly empty. It wasn't long before I started noticing things myself. On my evening shifts, the lights in the hallway near room 427 would flicker, and the air would feel colder the closer I got to the door. Once, as I was delivering towels to a guest, I swore I heard a faint knock coming from the inside of the room. I froze, staring at the door. The guest I was helping asked if everything was okay, and I muttered some excuse about hearing things. One night, curiosity got the better of me. It was almost midnight and the lobby was empty. I grabbed the master key and made my way up to the 4th floor, my heart pounding with every step. The hallway was eerily quiet, and the door to room 427 loomed at the end like a dark portal. When I reached the door, I hesitated. My hand trembled as I slid the key into the lock and turned it. The door creaked open, revealing a room frozen in time. Dust covered the furniture, and the air was heavy with the smell of mildew. It looked like no one had stayed there in years. But what caught my attention was the mirror above the dresser. It was shattered, with jagged shards hanging precariously from the frame. Then I heard it. A whisper. At first, I thought it was just the wind coming through the slightly cracked window, but the sound grew louder. It was a voice, faint but distinct, repeating something over and over. "Get out, get out." I stepped back, my pulse racing, and that's when the door slammed shut behind me. I fumbled for the handle, but it wouldn't budge. The whispering turned into frantic, angry screams, and the lights in the room began to flicker violently. My chest tightened as I backed away from the door, bumping into the dresser. Suddenly, a loud bang came from the closet like something was trying to break out. Panicking, I kicked the door with all my strength and it finally swung open. I bolted down the hallway and didn't stop until I was back in the lobby, gasping for breath. Mr. Grayson was standing at the desk, his face pale. "You went in, didn't you?" he said quietly. I nodded, unable to speak. He sighed and handed me a glass of water. "You should leave early tonight. And don't come back." I tried to press him for answers, but he wouldn't say anything more. That was my last night working at the hotel. Months later, I learned the truth. A few years before I started working there, a man had been staying in room 427. He was going through a messy divorce and had come to the hotel to clear his head. One morning, the housekeeping staff found him hanging from the ceiling fan. It was ruled a suicide, but strange things started happening in the room soon after. Guests complained of feeling watched, hearing whispers, and seeing a man's reflection in the mirror when they were alone. Eventually, the hotel stopped booking the room altogether, but the activity never stopped. To this day, I still have nightmares about that night. Sometimes I wake up hearing the same whisper, "Get out?" If you had the chance to explore a haunted room, knowing it could change your life forever, would you take the risk? Or would you let your curiosity go unanswered? Make sure to like, share, and subscribe if you're enjoying the vibe. Your support helps us keep uncovering the stories you won't find anywhere else. And trust me, you don't want to miss what's coming next, because the best, or the scariest, is yet to come.